Here on BBC Two, in 25 minutes, the Science Foundation course follows nuclear waste from its source in a reactor to its final disposal deep underground. That's after the Arts Foundation course looks at the image and the reality of rural life in Victorian England.
Seen through the eyes of the Victorian artist, the idyll of the country cottage, its roof green mossed and russet thatched, has an obvious appeal. Late Victorian picture postcard views suggest that the idyll can be more than romantic artist's licence. These photographs are of a real village, Old Warden in Bedfordshire. It's a village on a wealthy estate, created largely for the pleasure and benefit of its landlord. The village is designed in what is known as the picturesque tradition, developed in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Traditional vernacular materials, thatch, tiles and half-timbering are consciously used with a good deal of pretty ornament, and even the most necessary features will have the character of a stage set.
I suppose it is a real well.
Oh, I should think so. A well would have been essential. There was no mains water supply in a 19th century village like Old Warden. And this one, by the roadside, would have been a public well provided by the landlord.
Yes, and I suppose the structure is altogether too large and elaborate to have been a cottager's private well.
Yes, but that's precisely because Old Warden already was a tourist attraction when those picture postcards were taken.
You could say it's deliberately designed to be quaint. After all, what we have here in Old Warden is virtually a complete village designed to be a picturesque composition, for real.
The first owners, the Ongley family, who owned the village up to 1872, built or adapted cottages to the picturesque ideal. But that tradition was very largely a matter of show. This looks like a comfortable and spacious cottage, but it was actually built as 3 separate dwellings. The separate hearths craftily combined into one chimney to give the impression of a single house. And the timeless rural idyll could be constantly updated. This double cottage of Lord Ongley's was later given a half-timbered gable in a new style.
You can see that this isn't structural half-timbering. It's just a surface coating applied to the end wall.
Still, the result is a picturesque feature of the view from the footpath to the church. This updating of Old Warden was financed by Joseph Shuttleworth, who bought the estate in 1872. He'd made a fortune out of manufacturing portable steam engines for agriculture, and he used his wealth to set himself up as a landed gentleman, building a huge mansion to replace Lord Ongley's house, and fitting it out in conventionally lavish taste that included paintings of exactly the sort of rural landscape his contemporaries admired, but which his own products were helping to make a thing of the past. Shuttleworth refurbished much of the village where his estate workers lived. Here he improved a much older cottage, dressing it up to look picturesque and adding the Shuttleworth family crest. The double cottage had already been prettified by Lord Ongley, with thatch and arched windows. We can see how Shuttleworth improved the sanitation. He added substantial wash-houses, with coppers for heating the water, and, at the back, separate privies. He didn't remove overcrowding altogether. A family of 8 lived in this little cottage, even in the 20th century. However, the 1881 census shows that that was exceptional in Old Warden. Households there averaged under 4 members, which was rather below the national average. For a number of those households, Shuttleworth built completely new cottages in a sustained effort to give the village a new image. Surviving drawings show that the new cottages had 3 bedrooms, one for the parents, the second for boys, and the third for the girls. It was a common Victorian preoccupation in cottage design to separate the sexes. Shuttleworth provided each room with a fireplace, good accommodation for 2 families. But the structures, though sound, sanitary and efficient, were still treated to the picturesque uniform, a sort of estate livery. And it's important to remember that the bulk of those who lived here were Shuttleworth's tenants, and mostly worked for him on his estate.
Uniform development in a working agricultural village was characteristic of what was called a close village, that is, one which was owned by a single, wealthy landlord. Steppingley, owned by the Duke of Bedford, was part of successive dukes' massive rebuilding programmes undertaken from mid-century and financed by urban rents. Between 1843 and 1861, some 374 cottages were built on their Beds and Bucks estates. One of the commonest aspects of landlord development was restoration of the parish church. Something like 4/5 of all parish churches were rebuilt or restored in the Victorian period. The church was very much the centre of the whole of village life. We know that dissenters regularly used the church, and that the Wesleyans even shared in the harvest festival. Here at Steppingley, the Duke of Bedford rebuilt the essential elements of the village centre: church, school, and teacher's house. Like Shuttleworth, he used a smart facade of stone and half timbering. If we take one small corner of Steppingley, known as Peak's End, we can see from this 1843 estate survey the buildings which existed when the 7th Duke acquired the village. This later map shows the changes at Peak's End resulting from the Duke rebuilding in the late 1850s.
Clearly, a demolition and reconstruction programme on this scale was only possible where the land was in the hands of a single landlord. And this landlord elected to build very substantial cottages indeed for his labourers, with all the latest facilities.
And they undoubtedly were improvements. The Duke had quite strong views on the importance of a suitable number of bedrooms and modern amenities. He wrote in his preamble to the set of cottage plans drawn up by his surveyor that it was a landlord's duty to improve the dwellings of the labouring class and afford them the means of greater cleanliness, health and comfort in their own homes, to extend education, and thus raise the social and moral habits of those most valuable members of the community. Indeed, the plans were drawn up at a time of agricultural prosperity, and the Duke expected a good financial return on his cottage building, as well as the benefits accruing from a more comfortable workforce. Up to 1861, of the order of £3,500 was spent on Steppingley cottages, £150 per cottage. In the event, with dramatically falling rents from the 1870s, the investment proved quite a drain on the ducal funds and was subsidised by income from other sources. We can make some assessment of what life in one of the Duke's cottages might have been like. Rule number 9 states, "Gardens and allotments must be properly cultivated, and if neglected, the tenant will forfeit his holding." In this group of 3 dwellings, known as Park Farm cottages, the accommodation for each family consisted of a kitchen and wash-house on the ground floor, with 2 bedrooms above. From the 1871 census, we learn that these 3 cottages were lived in by 3 small families. Less precise clues about rural life can be got from late Victorian photography. Typically of Bedfordshire in this period, all the grown women living in Park Farm cottages supplemented the family income by lace making or straw plat making for the straw hat industry with its fashionable London market. So while the men were dependent on the estate for their employment, Steppingley women were not tied to the landlord for their income. Though architecturally Steppingley shows the regimented development of a close village on a rich estate, in other ways life there was less circumscribed than that might imply.
Not all agricultural labourers were nearly so well housed. Many of them continued to live in much older vernacular structures. That is, designed and built by local people, of local materials and to local standards. Here at Wortham in Suffolk, that means thatch,
clay lump rendered on the outside and often over a timber frame.
And in this case with a modern cement rendering. Such vernacular features are the original source of the picturesque that was so carefully contrived at Old Warden. Vernacular cottages were constantly being repaired and improved. This Victorian brick front hides an older structure of timber and clay lump. At Wortham, however, there was no single owner to improve the whole village. It was what is known as an open village, with many small landowners. Much of the 19th century village survives, complete with exceptionally large commons that were an essential part of the village economy, especially for the grazing of horses, cattle, ducks and geese. The houses were owned by small entrepreneurs, such as Charles Brown, captured here in a watercolour of 1860 by Richard Cobbold, rector of Wortham. His written and painted recollections form a rare and unusual documentary source for this village in the years up to 1860. Charles Brown ran the village shop, but also owned some 10 cottages and tenements, including the clay lump weaver's sheds next to his shop, which he converted into dwellings. They were only brick-fronted in the 20th century. Small owners like Brown lacked the capital for major developments, and even those that were built from scratch were hardly as substantial as Shuttleworth's at Old Warden. The poorer houses were little more than shacks. Richard Cobbold describes Moll King's cottage as the poorest hovel in the parish, but containing the tidiest people. Moll herself fulfilled the role of village nurse, providing remedies for the poor and lodgings, in a shed, for elderly and infirm labourers. Her home has completely disappeared. His picture of Old Mariah's, done in 1860, shows a similar hovel to the left of the house, divided by a fence, and so, presumably, a separate dwelling.
Of course, we've no documentary proof that this little building was actually inhabited, though the architectural evidence does rather seem to point that way. This brickwork and the chimney in the gable end seem to me too elaborate for something that was only a shed.
Inside, we can see the remains of a lath and plaster ceiling, a fireplace with an oven, and a good quality grate. Cobbold tells us nothing about this building, although he writes about the house next to it. The small farmhouse was occupied by old Maria, who'd been a nursemaid in the Cobbold household, then upper maid, cook, and finally married a neighbouring coachman, Christmas Durrant. They set up as tenants of Glebe Farm, and Cobbold bought this house for them when it must have been relatively new. Built of brick, with a slate roof, it was the home of the industrious and rising couple at the peak of their career.
Now, the front door opens straight into the farmhouse kitchen. This is really the only substantial room on the ground floor of the original house. It would have served as both parlour and kitchen. And then, of course, its cooking range must have been here, where there's a new, more elaborate fireplace. This evidently a later insertion, put in perhaps when a new kitchen was added in a separate outshot at the back. This is built as a sort of lean-to structure, enclosing the pump, and with a new stone sink. And beside it, a copper for the hot water. And then, sharing the same chimney with that, there's space for a new range.
You can see from outside how the house has been extended on two sides to accommodate the kitchen and the other farm rooms.
Now this outshot is plastered and whitewashed. Must, I think, have been used as a dairy with a good broad workshelf for the butter or cheese making. As a dairy, it had to be kept cool, so it's on the north side of the house. And it has these shutters for keeping the temperature even. They're held up by rather nice wrought iron hooks that I think must have been made by the local blacksmith. Actually, Old Mariah's is a nice contrast between vernacular and modern materials. The roof of the house is Welsh slate, and the walls here are of machine-made brick, though the plinth uses traditional flint nodules and a mixture of old tiles, probably handmade material, reused here. Then the outbuildings, they have traditional pan-tiled roof and are built of clay lump. You can see it's kept dry by a bitumen coating, which is absolutely essential. This is little more than rammed earth with a bit of straw to bind it. Firm enough if it stays dry, but the moment it gets wet, the various outbuildings must, of course, have accommodated the farm animals. That's to say, probably at least one pig, a cow and a horse. And another of the outbuildings was the privy. This is just a simple wooden box with a bucket underneath.
Soil from the privy was, of course, used as manure in the continuous cycle of husbandry, probably in the vegetable garden or the home field behind the house. The Durrants farmed on a small scale, 16 acres in 1851, 20 by 1861. There were many larger farmers in Wortham.
On great estates, farmhouses could be designed to reflect farm size and status. In Henry Stevens' Book of the Farm, we can see plans for first, second and third class farmhouses. The Duke of Bedford, in fact, built 4 classes of farmhouse to be let to tenants. The 350 acres of Park Farm at Steppingley warranted a first-class farmhouse, costing £1,700 to build. It's a gentleman's house, definitely not a vernacular building. Designed in a fashionable modern Gothic style, it's built in smart grey bricks. Standing in its own gardens, it faces away from the red brick industrial-looking farm buildings. They were put up at the same time at a cost of £2,600. In 1880, Punch satirised the social pretensions of the Victorian farmer, comparing him to his more modest predecessor some 30 years earlier. The first tenant of Park Farm was a new-style farmer, a local agricultural businessman who had originally come from London. The Bedford estate provided opportunities for this kind of investment.
On a more modest scale, John Snelling in Wortham, according to Cobbold, started with only 15 shillings, but by 1870 was an industrious and model farmer. The census records that he farmed 215 acres and employed 8 men and 5 boys. John Snelling's farm, Barber's Farm, is a good deal more substantial than Old Mariah's, and is only one of many in Wortham, which was, after all, a largely agricultural village. Wortham Hall, in Cobbold's day, had been modernised as a farmhouse, having previously been the medieval manor house. Copper Beech Farm was another substantial house, whose owner, William Reed, was churchwarden like his father before him. Cobbold describes him as surrounded by the poor for whom he cared, which is a reminder that the parish also included the very poor for whom life was a constant struggle. Israel Garnham is a good example of this sort of labourer. He lived in this cottage alongside the Long Green, vital, you remember, for grazing geese and a cow. Cobbold describes him as eccentric, intelligent, cunning and independent. After becoming dissatisfied as a labourer, he left Wortham for America, but returned in 3 years to set up as a woodcutter with his own donkey cart. This independent life was fine while his health lasted, but in old age he had to rely on relief payments, and finally hanged himself in 1862 rather than go into the workhouse. For the old people at Wortham, that meant being uprooted from their village and taken to Eye, 5 miles away. Wortham had its own workhouse, but reserved for pauper children. It was put up sometime after 1838, and although it's been altered, you can still see from the pattern of windows how it was designed to provide segregated accommodation for the sexes. The possibility of the workhouse was a constant fear for villagers, many of whom couldn't rely on regular or sufficient income, and so were unable to put money by against illness or infirmity. And Wortham had a long history of poverty. After the Napoleonic Wars, it had been the most pauperised parish of the county. Even Anne Smith, landlady at the Tumbledown Dick, ended up in the workhouse, though the pub itself is substantial enough to make a very desirable cottage today. Its landlord, John Smith, himself apparently needed to supplement his income. He worked as a mole catcher in the mornings before drinking with his customers in the evening. Cobbold's reminiscences are a reminder of the variety of employment in farming communities. There was Thatcher Jolly and Will Copping, the bricklayer, whose work will have been found throughout the parish. Perhaps the most obvious trades are those related to farming, the wheelwright and the blacksmith. This cottage, on the Long Green, housed Salter the blacksmith in 1860. It was probably he who had the large forge building put up sometime around the middle of the century. Inside, although it's now stripped, we can see how this simple vernacular structure contained two large forges. Evidently Salter worked both as a farrier or shoesmith and as a blacksmith, repairing farm tools. Nearby, another substantial cottage was the home of Fake, the wheelwright. Building and repairing wagons remained a crucial part of the agricultural economy throughout the 19th century.
One of the key points about understanding rural life in the 19th century is that it is impossible to generalise from place to place. For the ways of proceeding of every area were as varied as the soil types on which their agriculture was based. Steppingley and Wortham, for which we have such rich source material, can but provide individual examples. Village life and its economy naturally centred round farming and its rhythms and processes. For most villagers it was a subsistence economy. The common land and cottage gardens afforded essential food for labourers who couldn't rely on continuous employment or pensions. A few cottages still survive almost unaltered, their tenants living much as they would have done in Cobbold's day.
The Arts Foundation course completes its look at rural life in Victorian England next week when it discovers the impact steam power and mechanisation had on farming and social life. That's at the same time next Saturday morning. The series on culture and belief in Europe explores the stately home of Hardwick Hall at 7:30 tomorrow morning, built by the rich and powerful Elizabeth, Countess of Shrewsbury, better known as Bess of Hardwick. The hall was one of the most innovative houses of the time in Europe.